In the spring of 1863, the American Civil War had already torn through 3 years of blood and fire. Brother fought brother across fields that would never grow clean crops again. Cities burned. Governments collapsed and reformed in chaos. And in all that noise, in all that screaming wreckage of a nation, certain men learned to move like shadows. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a world apart. Steep ridges folded into deep valleys where mist pooled like water in a bowl. Communities clung to narrow creek beds, isolated from each other by days of hard travel, over trails that could kill a horse if you chose wrong. When war came, it didn't arrive as armies. It came as absence. The young men marched away and didn't return. Food grew scarce. Law dissolved. People locked their doors at night and prayed to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. Into this broken landscape walked a man in black. He called himself Nathan Crow, and he wore a cassock that had seen better days, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, the hem caked with mountain mud. He carried a battered leather Bible under one arm and spoke in a voice that was soft, reassuring, educated. When he arrived in a village, people noticed. A traveling priest was a rare blessing in those times. The established churches were empty, their pastors either conscripted or fled. Crow said he was bringing the word of God to those the war had forgotten. He first appeared in official records in Watauga County, North Carolina, in March of 1863. The village of Valley Cruces took him in without question. He conducted a service in someone's barn since the church had been shuttered. He prayed with families who had lost sons. He baptized infants whose fathers would never meet them. And he asked questions, always questions. Who lived alone? Who had savings hidden away? Which families had fled to relatives in other counties? He framed these inquiries as pastoral concern, the need to know his flock, to understand who required the most spiritual attention. People answered readily. They were desperate for someone to care, even if that someone was a stranger. Crow never stayed long. 3 days, maybe 4. Just long enough to perform a few services, share a few meals, make a few careful observations. Then he would announce that duty called him to the next isolated hollow, the next forgotten village. He would shoulder his small pack, tuck the Bible under his arm, and walk back into the forest. People watched him go with gratitude, unaware they had just been catalogued. His pattern was meticulous. He would arrive, observe, and leave. Then weeks later he would return. On the second visit he would remember everyone's names, recall details of their lives with unsettling accuracy. This built trust. By the third visit, he knew who was vulnerable. The first confirmed disappearance came in June. Margaret Thornton was a war widow, living with her sister Sarah on a small property near Boone. Their husband and brother-in-law had died at Shiloh, leaving them to manage the farm alone. When Nathan Crow visited, he spent an entire afternoon in their modest home, drinking tea, discussing scripture, and gently probing about their situation. He asked about family, about money, about whether they felt safe so far from town. Sarah later told authorities that Crow had been particularly interested in Margaret's generous spirit. He praised her for maintaining the farm despite such hardship. He asked if they kept their savings in a bank, or if, like so many rural folk, they preferred to keep valuables close. Margaret, trusting, mentioned the tin can hidden under the floorboards. $230 in gold coins. Everything they had left in the world. 3 days after Crow's visit, Margaret was gone. Sarah woke to find the front door standing open, the morning mist curling into the house. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, just absence. And when Sarah checked the hiding place under the floor, the tin can was empty. But there was something else. The prayer book Crow had lent Margaret lay open on the living room table. Someone had written in the margin, the handwriting small and precise. "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not today." When Sarah brought this to the county authorities, they began asking questions in nearby villages. And that's when the pattern emerged. A merchant named Edwin Hayes had disappeared in April after hosting a traveling priest at his boarding house in Allegheny County. A woman named Dorothy Klein vanished in May, days after confessing to an itinerant preacher that she was guarding her late husband's life savings. Each case carried the same signature: isolation, a visit from a man in black, a disappearance without violence, and missing money. The authorities tried to track him, but Nathan Crow had already learned the mountains better than most men who'd been born there. He knew the back trails, the caves, the river crossings that didn't appear on any map. He could vanish into the forests and emerge days later 50 miles away, presenting himself to a new community as if he'd just descended from heaven itself. One man nearly became a victim and lived to describe what that felt like. Samuel Patterson was a war veteran who'd lost his left leg at Chattanooga. He lived alone in a cabin so remote that even neighbors were a day's walk away. When Crow arrived in September, Patterson was grateful for the company. The loneliness of those mountains could crush a man's spirit as surely as any wound. They talked for hours. Patterson, eager to share his story with someone who seemed to care, mentioned the gold coins he'd saved before the war, his insurance against future hardship. That night, Patterson woke to a presence in his room. Moonlight filtered through the window, just enough to see Crow standing beside the bed, holding a pillow in both hands. Patterson later told investigators that what terrified him most wasn't the pillow or the obvious intention. It was Crow's face. There was no emotion there. No rage, no guilt, no hesitation. Just the blank expression of someone about to complete a task, like chopping wood or mending a fence. Patterson fought. He screamed, thrashed, knocked over a lamp. The noise and chaos were enough. Crow released the pillow, stepped back, and without a word, walked out the door. Patterson heard hoofbeats fade into the forest. By the time he could move again, Crow was miles away. That testimony gave investigators their first real description. White male, medium height, dark hair graying at the temples, soft-spoken, educated accent. He wore a priest's cassock, always black, always slightly worn, and he carried a Bible that looked like it had been dropped in rivers and dried by campfires 100 times. But when authorities tried to verify his credentials, they found nothing. No diocese had ordained a Nathan Crow. No church recognized him. No seminary had records of his training. The name itself was likely a fabrication, a mask worn over something older and darker. Newspapers began publishing warnings. The Watauga Democrat ran a front-page notice describing the false priest and his methods. But by the time the ink dried, Crow had already moved to another county, another set of isolated farms, another group of people who hadn't yet heard the warnings. He was always one step ahead, always moving, a predator who understood that survival meant never stopping long enough to be cornered. And then in August, a discovery changed everything. A farmer named Thomas Whitley found belongings buried in a shallow hole near an abandoned camp on the banks of the New River. Not just one person's belonging, 12 different sets. Wallets, pocket watches, letters, Bibles, with names written on the fly leaves. When authorities cross-referenced those names with missing persons reports, they found matches. Margaret Thornton's leather wallet, Edwin Hayes's engraved pocket watch, Dorothy Klein's silver bracelet. 12 people. 12 lives that had simply ended after an encounter with a man in black who promised salvation and delivered oblivion. But the bodies themselves, still missing. Crow had found ways to make people vanish completely, and the mountains, with their caves and ravines and rivers that ran fast and cold, kept his secrets well. The investigation intensified through the fall of 1863. Wilkes County Sheriff Robert Hendricks became the lead investigator, coordinating between multiple jurisdictions, trying to create a coherent picture from scattered reports. He understood that Crow wasn't simply a thief who'd escalated to violence. This was someone who operated with chilling calculation, someone who understood human psychology better than most trained physicians. Hendricks began mapping Crow's movements, pinning reports to a large map in his office. Red marks for confirmed sightings, black marks for disappearances, blue marks for locations where belongings had been found. A pattern emerged. Crow moved in a rough circuit through the mountains, returning to certain areas repeatedly, but never to the exact same village. He would exhaust the vulnerable population in one region, then move on, allowing time to pass before circling back, when memories had faded and new vulnerable people had appeared. Then in October, Hendricks received an anonymous letter. The handwriting was educated, almost elegant. The paper was good quality, not the rough stock most mountain folk used. The letter contained detailed information about Crow's movements, specific dates and locations, conversations he'd had with people in various villages. What struck Hendricks most was the tone. This wasn't written by a concerned citizen performing a civic duty. There was anger in every word, a personal fury that suggested intimate knowledge. The letter ended with a cryptic instruction. Look in Bristol, Tennessee. He's back where it all began. Hendricks traveled to Bristol, a town straddling the Tennessee-Virginia border. There he discovered that Nathan Crow had a history, a real documented past that predated his appearance in the mountains. 20 years earlier, in 1843, there had been a man named Nathaniel Crowley who worked as a clerk in a law firm. He'd been married, lived a seemingly normal life, attended church regularly. But in 1846, his wife died under circumstances that were never fully explained. She was found at the base of a cliff near their home. Authorities ruled it an accident, but rumors persisted that the marriage had been troubled, that Nathaniel had grown increasingly controlling. After his wife's death, Nathaniel Crowley sold everything and disappeared. No one in Bristol had heard from him in nearly 17 years. Now, connecting dates and details, it became clear that Nathaniel Crowley and Nathan Crow were the same person. He'd shortened his name, assumed a new identity, and rebuilt his life in the shadows. Hendricks spoke to elderly residents who still remembered Nathaniel. They described him as intelligent and articulate, but fundamentally cold. One woman, Elizabeth Morrow, who'd been a neighbor, recalled something disturbing. She said Nathaniel had a habit of studying people, watching their behavior with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He would ask seemingly innocent questions that revealed intimate details about their lives, and he had an uncanny ability to make people trust him instantly, as if he'd learned to mimic sincerity without actually feeling it. This information was crucial. It showed that Crow's methods weren't improvised. He'd been refining these skills for decades. The persona of the traveling priest was simply the latest evolution, chosen because it was perfect for the chaos of wartime. But the anonymous letter had promised Crow would return to Bristol. Hendricks decided to wait, maintaining a discreet watch on the town, particularly around locations connected to Nathaniel's old life. Weeks passed. Winter approached, and then, through careful investigation and a bit of luck, Hendricks learned the identity of the letter's author. It was Nathaniel's brother, Jacob Crowley. Jacob had been living under a different name in a remote cabin near Shady Valley, Tennessee, for years. When Hendricks confronted him, Jacob showed no surprise, as if he'd been waiting for this conversation for a long time. He invited the sheriff inside and told a story that explained everything. Jacob said he and Nathaniel had been close as children, but he'd always known something was wrong with his older brother. Nathaniel was incapable of genuine emotional connection. He saw people as objects, tools to achieve his goals. When Nathaniel's wife died, Jacob suspected foul play but couldn't prove anything. Nathaniel sensed his brother's suspicions and made veiled threats. Jacob fled Bristol, changed his name, and tried to build a life away from that darkness. But over the years, Jacob heard rumors, a traveling preacher involved in strange disappearances. The pattern was familiar. He recognized his brother's methods. Finally, Jacob decided he had to act. He sent the anonymous letter providing Hendricks with enough information to build a case. And recently, he'd traveled into the mountains to confront Nathaniel directly, to make one last attempt to convince him to surrender. The confrontation had failed. Nathaniel refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. He told Jacob he was simply living according to his nature, that society's rules were arbitrary constructs that didn't apply to people like him who could see beyond conventional morality. Jacob realized then that his brother was completely lost, that there was no salvation for someone so fundamentally disconnected from humanity. Hendricks asked Jacob for help. He needed someone who knew Nathaniel intimately, who could predict his movements and reactions. Jacob agreed with one condition. He wanted to be present when Nathaniel was captured. Not for revenge, but because he felt someone from the Crowley family needed to witness the end of this terrible story. Using information from Nathaniel's diary and Jacob's knowledge of his brother's habits, investigators identified likely locations where Crow might spend the winter. The mountains were becoming impassable. Even someone as experienced as Crow would need a more permanent shelter soon. They focused surveillance on a cave system near the Watauga River, a location Nathaniel had mentioned repeatedly in his notes as a reliable refuge. On a cold November night, smoke was spotted rising from that exact location. A surveillance team, led by an experienced tracker named Daniel McCoy, confirmed it was Crow. But they held their position, watching, waiting for the right moment. For 3 days, they observed Nathaniel going through his routines. He was cautious, always checking his surroundings, but there was something different about him now. His movements seemed more nervous, less confident, as if he sensed the walls closing in. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. Another man appeared, approaching the cave on foot. When he got close, Crow emerged to meet him. Even from a distance, the surveillance team could see the conversation was tense. The visitor was gesturing angrily. Crow stood silent, listening. After about 20 minutes, the visitor turned and walked away. Crow watched him go before retreating back into the cave. McCoy made a quick decision. He sent men to follow the visitor while he continued watching Crow. They tracked the visitor for 2 days back to Shady Valley. It was Jacob Crowley. The brothers had met one final time, and now the trap was ready to close. The plan was crafted with precision. Jacob explained that Nathaniel had certain habits, rituals he followed religiously. Every morning before dawn, he would leave his shelter to watch the sunrise from a specific vantage point. It was a moment of vulnerability, a brief period when his guard was down. On the morning of November 15th, 12 men took up positions around the cave and the overlook. They waited in freezing temperatures, completely still and silent, as the first light began to brighten the horizon. The cave entrance opened. Nathaniel emerged, wrapped in a heavy coat, carrying his Bible. He paused, surveyed his surroundings with a careful eye, then began climbing the rocky path to his vantage point. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky orange and red when Nathaniel reached the top. He stood there, gazing at the sunrise, and for a brief moment there was something almost human in his expression. Perhaps it was aesthetic appreciation. Perhaps it was nostalgia. It was impossible to know what went through that mind. Then Hendricks gave the signal. Men emerged from their positions on all sides simultaneously. Nathaniel realized too late. He turned sharply, looking for an escape, but he was completely surrounded. For a moment that stretched like eternity, he stood perfectly still, his eyes calculating probabilities, weighing options. Then his gaze found Jacob standing among the lawmen. Something changed in Nathaniel's expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like curiosity, as if he were genuinely interested in understanding why his brother had done this. Jacob stepped forward. He didn't shout or make dramatic accusations. His voice was low and weary. He told Nathaniel that this had to end, that the people he'd destroyed deserved justice, that families, still searching for loved ones, deserved answers. Nathaniel listened with that characteristic blank expression. When Jacob finished, Nathaniel spoke calmly, almost politely. He said he understood what Jacob was trying to do, but Jacob had never truly understood him. He explained with frightening coldness that he felt no remorse because he genuinely couldn't comprehend why he should. To him, people were simply resources, no different from picking apples from a tree. That statement revealed everything. This wasn't a man consumed by evil in the traditional sense. This was someone whose mind worked fundamentally differently, someone incapable of processing empathy or basic human connection. Hendricks ordered Nathaniel handcuffed. He didn't resist. He allowed the shackles to be placed on his wrists with the same indifference one might allow one's height to be measured. As he was led down the trail, he continued to hold the Bible under his arm. When a deputy tried to take it, Nathaniel politely asked to keep it. Hendricks allowed it, after checking there was nothing dangerous hidden in the pages. The descent took all day. Nathaniel made no attempt to escape. He walked calmly, occasionally commenting on the weather or the terrain, as if he were on a casual stroll rather than being taken to face charges of horrific crimes. This forced normalcy was more disturbing than any display of violence could have been. When they arrived in Boone at dusk, a crowd was waiting. News had spread quickly. There were faces of victims' families, people who'd lost loved ones and never known what happened. There was anger in those eyes, but also something deeper, a desperate need to understand, to find meaning in this tragedy. Nathaniel was taken to the county jail and placed in the most secure cell. Guards were stationed in constant shifts. The days following the capture were marked by growing tension. People traveled for days across frozen mountains just to see the man who'd hidden behind the black cassock. The interrogations began the morning after arrest. Hendricks assembled a small team, including Jacob, 2 county magistrates, and a clerk to document everything. Nathaniel answered some questions with clinical precision, but declined others, claiming he couldn't remember specific details. He treated everything as administrative record, not human lives. One of the most shocking revelations came when Nathaniel admitted to keeping detailed notes, not only about potential victims, but also about locations where he'd left evidence. He revealed that he'd kept another notebook hidden in a metal box buried beneath a marked tree near the Doe River in Tennessee. A team was dispatched and found it exactly where he said. The contents were even more disturbing. 27 different people. 27 lives Nathaniel had studied, plotted against, and eventually eliminated. Among these were cases authorities didn't even know were connected. A merchant who disappeared in 1861, a teacher who left her school one afternoon in 1862 and never returned, a war veteran who set out to visit family and simply vanished. During interrogations, Jacob was allowed to ask questions directly. What he wanted to know wasn't about the crime specifically, but about when it all began. When did Nathaniel realize he was different? When did he decide to use that difference to harm others? Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering. He said he'd always known he was different. Even as a child, he realized other people's emotions were mysterious to him. He saw people crying and didn't understand why. He saw people forming friendships and falling in love, and it all seemed artificial, like actors on a stage. He learned to mimic these emotions by careful observation. He discovered that if he said certain words and made certain facial expressions, people responded predictably. It was like learning rules of a game. When he realized he could manipulate people's emotions to his advantage, it simply became a skill to be refined. Regarding the first time he took a life, Nathaniel was vague. He only said it happened long ago, before he was even married. It had been almost accidental, a situation that spiraled out of control. But afterward, he realized he felt nothing. No horror, no guilt, no regret, just clinical curiosity. That's when he fully understood his true nature. The magistrates were visibly shaken. One elderly man asked if there was anything Nathaniel truly valued. Nathaniel thought for a moment and responded with disconcerting honesty. He valued his freedom, his ability to move and do as he wanted. He valued his intelligence. And strangely, he valued the Bible he carried, not for religious reasons, but because it was perfectly designed for his purposes. It was respected, opened doors, was portable, and no one suspected a man carrying a Bible. That answer revealed more than anything else. Even sacred objects were mere tools to him. There was nothing genuine in his existence, no real connection to any aspect of normal human experience. As interrogations continued, authorities worked to locate the sites Nathaniel described. It was slow work. Winter made many areas inaccessible. But they did find some places, caves where belongings were hidden, ravines where earth showed signs of disturbance. Each discovery confirmed his confessions. Victims' families began arriving to give statements. Each story was painful. A daughter who never knew her father, a son who spent decades searching for his mother, sibling, friends, neighbors, all bearing the weight of unexplained losses that were finally beginning to make sense. The most disturbing realization was how many of these people had known Nathaniel personally. He'd shared meals with them, prayed in their homes, offered comfort during the war, all while simply assessing, calculating, biding his time. The betrayal of trust was almost as painful as the losses themselves. The trial was scheduled for January 8th, 1864. Prosecutor Harrison Blackwell focused initially on 5 cases where evidence was irrefutable. Margaret Thornton, Edwin Hayes, Dorothy Klein, Samuel Patterson, who survived, and Thomas Whitley, who found the buried belongings. Finding defense counsel was difficult. Finally, a young lawyer named Marcus Webb agreed, believing everyone deserved representation. But during preparatory meetings, Nathaniel showed little interest in building a real defense. When Webb explored arguments about sanity, Nathaniel refused. He insisted he was perfectly sane, that he fully understood his actions and their consequences. He simply didn't agree he should be punished for being different. The trial began on that cold January morning. The courthouse was packed. Judge Silas Montgomery entered with a serious expression. Nathaniel was brought in, still in chains, wearing simple clothes without his cassock. His eyes scanned every face in the room, still cataloging information. Blackwell's opening was powerful but not sensational. He presented facts clearly and methodically. How Nathaniel had systematically exploited faith during war. How he'd studied victims like prey. How he'd used the priest's robe as a calculated tool. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Nathaniel's notebooks displayed to the jury, pages filled with notes about people who disappeared. Victims' belongings presented, each representing a life cut short. Maps marking locations where evidence was found. The first testimony came from Samuel Patterson, who described waking to see Crow holding a pillow above him. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Patterson recounted that blank, emotionless expression. Sarah Thornton testified about her sister's disappearance and the chilling message left in the prayer book. Thomas Whitley described finding the buried belongings that first revealed the true scale. Then Jacob took the stand. His testimony was perhaps the most important. He explained Nathaniel's history, the death of his wife, and the years of manipulation. He described the letter he sent and the confrontation in the mountains. When asked why he ultimately turned against his brother, Jacob's answer was simple. Because the dead deserve someone to speak for them, even if it meant betraying my own blood. The defense had almost nothing to work with. Webb attempted to question the chain of custody for some evidence and raised doubts about whether all 27 cases could be conclusively linked to his client. But the notebooks were in Nathaniel's handwriting. The pattern was undeniable. On the third day, Nathaniel himself took the stand against his lawyer's advice. Blackwell asked him directly, "Did he kill these people?" Nathaniel answered with the same chilling calm he'd shown throughout. He confirmed he'd taken what he needed from those who had it. He explained that he saw no moral distinction between taking money and taking life. Both were simply resources to be acquired. The courtroom erupted. Judge Montgomery had to call for order. When asked if he felt any remorse, Nathaniel said he couldn't feel something he didn't understand. He acknowledged intellectually that his actions caused suffering, but he was incapable of experiencing that suffering himself. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentence came swift and certain, death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. Nathaniel showed no reaction to the verdict. As he was led from the courtroom, he looked one last time at Jacob. The two brothers' eyes met across the crowded room. Jacob would later say he saw nothing in those eyes, no plea for forgiveness, no anger, no fear, just emptiness. In the days before the execution, Nathaniel made no requests. He ate the meals provided, read his Bible, and spoke politely to guards. On the morning of February 12, 1864, he was led to the gallows erected in the courthouse square. Hundreds gathered to witness. Some came for justice, some for closure, some simply to see the end of a nightmare. Nathaniel walked to the platform with steady steps. When offered a chance to make a final statement, he declined. The hood was placed over his head, the rope around his neck. The trap dropped. Nathan Crow, the false priest who'd preyed on the faithful during America's darkest years, was dead. But the questions he left behind would never be fully answered. 27 confirmed victims. How many more were never found? The mountains keep their secrets, and some caves have never been explored. Jacob Crowley returned to his cabin in Shady Valley and lived out his remaining years in quiet solitude. He never spoke publicly about his brother again. When he died in 1891, his gravestone bore only his name and dates, no mention of family, no epitaph. The case of Nathan Crow became a cautionary tale whispered in Appalachian communities for generations, about the danger of trusting strangers, about how evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it arrives wearing a collar, carrying a Bible, speaking words of comfort while measuring you for a grave. And somewhere in those mountains, in unmarked places known only to the dead, 27 souls rest without headstones, their stories preserved only in the fading ink of a killer's meticulous notes.